Hi, welcome to Polyphonic Press. I'm Jeremy Boyd,
I'm John Van Dyke.
and today we're going to be talking about whether the Beatles are overrated. Here we go. Alright, so we found this article on noisy.vice.com, and basically it's talking about, it's sort of within the 50-year anniversary of the Beatles coming on the Ed Sullivan Show, which is coming up in February. And this guy wrote this article about whether he wants people to stop saying that the Beatles are overrated. Give the article a read because it's absolutely hilarious, the take that he puts it on, but it raises a couple interesting questions on whether the Beatles are overrated or not. What's your opinion on the Beatles, whether they're overrated?
I've always sort of followed the thing that they were both the most underrated and overrated band in the world.
Yeah.
Because they're overrated for all the wrong reasons and they're underrated for all the right reasons.
Yeah.
I find.
Yeah, I think, Beatlemania certainly was just an absolutely insane time. It must have been anyway. At least it looks like from the film that you see and everything.
Yeah, it wasn't exactly there.
Mobs of people waiting for the airport for them to arrive. And, their early stuff isn't bad, but...
They were one of those bands, and where a lot of bands, they sort of drop off after the year, their most visceral stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the most is usually, there's always exceptions, but it's usually towards the beginning of their career. I find that's a lot of different bands.
Yeah.
And they go through cycles. The Beatles are one of the only bands that I can really think of that actually, you actually witness them get better over time.
Yeah. But the other thing too is they were still a really good band in the beginning, and they worked really hard at it too. Like they spent a lot of time playing in clubs, spent a lot of time in Hamburg, Germany. And this was like 3 or 4 years before they even had a record deal. They were just, they were working on getting as tight as they could, because in those days you had to be good, because there wasn't such a thing as auto-tune or, time correction or things like that we have today. So you had to be a good musician, you had to be a good band in order to get any sort of recognition. So I think, people are quick to say, oh, they were overrated, but they don't really realize the amount of work that they actually had to be a good band. And that's why those bands were good bands in the 60s and the 70s, that they took the time to be musicians because they had to if they wanted to get ahead. The other thing too that is really interesting about the Beatles is before they came to, they refused to come to America before they had a number one hit. They said, we're not going to America unless we have a number one hit, which I think is from a business standpoint is a really smart move. So I think that's maybe why Beatlemania was so huge as it did, because they had a number one hit, but they created this mystery behind it because they weren't in America when they were number one in America. So I think maybe that has something to do with it as well.
Although it kind of backfired on them. They stopped doing live shows entirely in 1966 because of the Beatlemania.
Yeah.
It got too much for them.
Well, that's another thing too.
And that's only 2 years after they first got to North America.
It wasn't long. It wasn't long. Their touring career wasn't... I guess their touring career probably was about 4 years, from 62 to 66, which isn't that long of a time. It's only, but I think because they did so much in those couple of years, it seems like a lot longer than it was, but when you think about it, it really isn't that long.
They were very prolific.
Yeah.
Yes, but then again, the industry demanded more of bands.
That's true.
People, a lot of bands would release maybe about 2 albums a year.
Yeah.
Now it's on average one every other couple of years.
Yeah. The other thing too is the musicianship in the band was really good. Paul McCartney is a really good bass player. He sort of developed jazz style of bass playing where it's more melodic, not really a rhythmic bass player. Ringo kind of held down the rhythm. You didn't really need to be a rhythmic bass player. Ringo kind of took care of everything. And that's another thing. Ringo doesn't get a lot of the recognition that he deserves because he wasn't a songwriter. But he was the soul of the band, pretty much. If you listen to early recordings with Pete Best on it, it doesn't really sound like the Beatles. And so Ringo added a lot when he joined the band. And I don't think that Ringo gets a lot of credit that he deserves.
Another thing is a lot of people call him like a crappy drummer. And I don't entirely agree with that either. He had this backbeat thing. And actually, he could be quite solid, especially if you listen to things like The Word Is Love and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't John Bonham and he wasn't Keith Moon. But
he wasn't trying to be.
He wasn't trying. He served his purpose by being a solid drummer. Like he... and coming up with unique drum patterns too. Like I always go back to songs like "Get Back," where he's playing this kind of military thing on the snare drum. When that song calls for just a straight kind of blues shuffle, but if you take that beat away and replace it, it doesn't sound like "Get Back." That's kind of the hook of the song. So he added a lot more than people actually realize. But in the same stroke, the Beatles are overrated in a sense that people kind of put them up on a pedestal, and they're more than icons now. They're almost archetypes.
They're rock gods in
pretty
the truest sense of the form.
And so I think people kind of don't. They're like you said, they're underrated and overrated at the same time. And I also think that they're one of the most important bands.
Oh, no kidding.
Because they kind of did things like no other bands, like Elvis had movies, but no other bands had a movie before them. They really had the first concept album with Sgt. Pepper.
Actually, I don't know if they do. I would say Moody Blues with what was it? Days of Future Past is the first.
Did
they?
they?
66.
66. Okay. Okay. Well, they had one of the first concept albums.
They were definitely early.
Yeah. So they kind of, and they were big innovators at the same time. Like if you think about Sgt. Pepper and all the different noises and all the different things, like that was recorded with a 4-track tape machine. And basically all they did was they took 2 tracks, like they recorded 2 tracks and then bounced it to the 4th track, recorded 2 more tracks, bounced those to the 3rd track, and they kept just reusing all the tracks, which is, that album is kind of pieced together. It's not a live band recording album. That album is really meticulously put together. But it's interesting that they only did that with a 4-track tape machine.
Well, I think partly what the deciding factor to make an album like Sgt. Pepper's was because they stopped touring and and that allowed them to experiment more. They didn't have to play a lot of the things that they had come up with on this album live. So they could do whatever the hell they wanted in the studio.
Yeah, it was designed not to be played live. And then they kind of wanted to get back into live with the Let It Be, which was they were going to do a big concert.
That was sort of almost like a last hurrah sort of thing. Things were dying off then.
Yeah.
So they decided, let's get on the roof and play.
But John Lennon really wanted to get back into playing live and being a rock and roll band. Ironically, throughout the 70s, it was Paul who ended up touring a lot, and the others didn't really do much touring.
John Lennon did a bit.
A little bit, but not as much as Wings.
He had a pretty big tour around 1969, but right up to about 1972, and then he stopped. He stopped touring.
So basically, that's pretty much. We could go on basically about the Beatles, but we won't. That's pretty much like that's how we've always felt about the Beatles. They're both overrated and underrated for different reasons. And but let us know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think the Beatles are overrated? Do you think they're underrated? Do you hate the Beatles? Do you love the Beatles? Let us know. You can check us out on Twitter and Facebook. Be sure to subscribe so you know when we post new videos. And that's about it. I'm Jeremy Boyd.
I'm Jon Van Dyke.
Take it easy.